Growing Cities, Growing Problems by Tami Zambo. Population growth throughout history. The number of people in the world has grown almost since human beings have existed. One increase in population began about AD 900 as people began raising crops and livestock in settlements. The world's population began to grow rapidly around AD 1700. One reason for this growth is that the plague had finally stopped being a major cause of death in Europe. This rapid population growth helped make the Industrial Revolution possible. The use of machines helped the world's population grow even more rapidly. The population of the world in 1700 was about 600 million people. In AD 500, the population of the world had been about 200 million people. And in AD 1000, there were about 300 million people in the world. Cities existed from early on in human history. Ancient Rome had a population of 1 million people around AD 175. The city of Thebes in ancient Egypt had 50,000 people, as early as 1300 BC. The world's population grew more quickly from about 1750. By 1800, it was about 1 billion people. From about 1950 to the present, the population has skyrocketed. Today, there are about 6.4 billion people in the world, and the number climbs higher every year. Cities and megacities. The world's population increased during the Industrial Revolution, in part because of scientific advancements. Modern medicine and sanitation, for example, both saved and extended people's lives. This allowed them to have more and healthier children. The new industries led to factories being built in the cities. Large numbers of people began moving from rural areas to take jobs in the factories. Cities grew quickly as a result. By 2001, there were nearly 20 city regions with more than 10 million people, or megacities. In recent years, however, some cities declined in population. About 20 major cities in the United States, including Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Toledo, Ohio, have had declining populations. The population explosion. The rate of population growth has sometimes been called a population explosion or exponential growth. Exponential means that the growth begins slowly but later picks up tremendous speed. What this idea means is that it takes less and less time for the number of people in the world to double. For example, the population doubled from 500 million to 1 billion people from 1500 to 1800, a period of 300 years. It only took about 130 years to double again to 2 billion people, and another 45 years to double once more to 4 billion people by the late 1970s. Developed countries have well-developed industries and economies. Developing countries are experiencing the greatest population growth. By about 2007, 1/2 of the world's population will live in cities. Almost all of this growth will occur in the urban areas of developing countries. In developed countries, 75% of the population already lives in cities. People on the move. Cities are growing partly because the number of residents born is greater than the number dying. In addition, cities are surrounding areas that were once considered rural. A third cause of growth is the movement of people. People move from rural to urban areas for many reasons. Possibly the most common reason is that cities provide more jobs than rural areas. Cities also often provide better education and better health care. The same reasons encourage immigration. When immigrants arrive in a city, they typically settle into small communities within that city. After they have made a strong start, they send for family members from their home country to join them. This pattern, called chain immigration, describes most of the immigration in United States history. People also moved to cities because of disappearing jobs in rural areas. Some farms in the United States are being taken over by large farming corporations or are turned into housing developments. Other rural jobs, such as fishing, mining, oil production, and ranching, have also declined. Another important reason is called eco-migration, which means that environmental changes force people to move. Wind and water have eroded the soil in some areas. In other areas, the soil's nutrients have been lost and it can no longer be farmed. Eco-migration can also result from floods, drought, mudslides, and hurricanes. Political unrest is yet another reason for immigration. Wars and other conflicts in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, for example, have forced hundreds of thousands of people to move. These people must find new places to live. Many eventually move to cities to make a new start. Overcrowding and slums. Growing cities face many problems, particularly in developing countries. One of these problems is overcrowding, which makes housing the most immediate problem. When a city grows very quickly, newcomers arrive faster than housing can be built. People who cannot find housing must make it themselves from scraps of wood, cardboard, and metal. In many cities, shanty towns or slums filled with homemade shelters extend for miles. Many city dwellers in developing countries live in slums. Some slums take up enormous areas of land. One slum area of Nairobi, Kenya, has 400,000 residents. Parts of Calcutta, India, and Lagos, Nigeria, are also slums. Slums usually lack basic sanitation, clean water, and electricity. These conditions make it easier for diseases such as cholera, dysentery, typhus, typhoid, and tuberculosis to spread rapidly. Housing and basic services are not the only concerns in the growing cities of developing countries. Poorly built factories pollute the air, and cars and trucks create still more air pollution. In Mexico City, Mexico, air pollution has become so severe that people are only allowed to drive their cars 6 days a week. Urban sprawl. Growing cities in developed countries face challenges too. One major problem is urban sprawl. Most cities spread outward as they grow, adding one suburb after another. Many people move to these suburbs because they have more room for a large house and lawn. But suburbs hold more than just houses. They also need schools, town halls, churches, office parks for work, and shopping areas, such as malls. They also need roads to connect all the buildings together and to connect each suburb to the heart of the city. Some suburbs spread out so far from the center of a city that they run into suburbs of other cities. The resulting chain of cities and towns is called an urban corridor. One urban corridor in the United States extends from Washington, D.C. to Boston, Massachusetts, a distance of about 500 miles, or 800 kilometers. Ecological footprints. Urban sprawl takes an immense amount of space, including important natural areas. In the United States, every year new suburbs cover thousands of square miles of land that was once farmland, forest, or wetland. Cities use even more land than this. Cities have to get rid of their waste and need natural resources such as water, wood, and petroleum. All of these things are needed to support the people who live in a sprawling city. The combination of a city's surface area and the land needed to supply natural resources for the population is called an ecological footprint. For example, the ecological footprint of New York City includes the reservoirs or artificial lakes northwest of the city. One of these reservoirs, the Cannonsville Reservoir, is more than 100 miles northwest of Manhattan. Ecological footprints are larger in developed countries than in developing ones. People in developed nations consume or use up more resources. Cities with their factories and automobiles create large amounts of carbon dioxide. Increasing levels of this gas may be connected to the global rise in the average temperature of Earth's surface. This rise in temperature is known as global warming. And there is more. The cities of developed countries face still more problems. Urban sprawl creates more traffic as people drive longer distances to get from the suburbs to the city. This creates more air pollution and uses up more of the world's limited oil reserves. The world's supply of fresh water is also growing scarce, yet populations in growing cities demand more of it. In addition, as some governments spend more money and attention on suburbs, less money and attention are spent on maintaining and repairing cities. Buildings, bridges, and roads begin to break down. Jobs dry up as businesses move to the suburbs, and unemployment increases. Many inner-city residents cannot afford to move to the suburbs, and their poverty deepens. The story of Easter Island. What if a population grew so large that the land could not support it? The example of Easter Island in the Pacific Ocean may provide a clue. Today, this island is known for its hundreds of enormous stone statues. Archaeologists have learned that the island was settled by a group of Polynesians who arrived by sea around AD 400. The land was fertile, and a forest covered the island. For about 700 years, the population remained low, and the society prospered. About 7,000 people may have lived on the island by 1600. The rising population used up the resources of the island. The trees disappeared as the people built houses, canoes, and the beams they used to move the statues. The cleared land was used to grow crops, but the soil eroded because the trees were no longer there to anchor it. The people could no longer build fishing boats and grow crops, so their food supply decreased. Competition for the scarce resources grew fierce, and war broke out. By 1900, the peak population of 7,000 had dropped to 111. New ideas. Many people have thought of ways to solve some of the problems that come with population growth. For example, paper manufacturing companies in the United States have long been involved with the logging industry, which cuts down the trees needed to make paper. In recent years, most paper companies have learned that the cutting down of trees can do a great deal of harm to the environment. Therefore, these paper companies are now part of programs for planting new trees to replace those that have been cut down. Similarly, most communities in the United States have a recycling program. These programs recycle newspapers, glass bottles, and tin cans. The recycling of newspapers means that new paper can be made from old paper instead of from fresh wood. Many city governments in the United States make certain that at least some of the paper they purchase comes from recycling, rather than from cutting fresh timber. In some parts of the United States, new businesses have been moving to small cities instead of large ones. This cuts down on big city problems such as overcrowding. These smaller cities, called micropolitan areas, have certain advantages. They are closer to rural areas, so they can provide small businesses that process and market agricultural products. Businesses like these make it possible for small farms to prosper. In addition, the governments of smaller cities can respond more quickly to the needs of their residents.